Mario Maker 1 is officially dead. The servers have been offline for nearly 5 months now, and most players have returned to the sequel on the Switch. But some players have opted to continue playing Maker 1, or just retire from the game outright. Why is this preference for the first game so strong amongst some of these players? Today we're going to find out. Some differences between the games are obvious downgrades, like how you can't spin with items in Mario Maker 2, or how there are no more amiibo costumes. But others are much less obvious. I'm going to break these changes into two different categories: gameplay and external changes. The biggest external change is not being able to edit downloaded levels. If you never played the first game, if you ever got stuck playing a level and couldn't figure out what to do, you could take it into the editor and search for either a hidden path or practice the section that you were struggling with. This was a glaring issue with Mario Maker 2 right from the start, and while the community has caught up to a certain extent with an external browser-based level viewer, and customary practice doors or practice levels, it cannot compare to the built-in convenience that was right there in Mario Maker 1. Why was this feature removed? I don't know. I seem to recall a Nintendo representative at E3 or a similar event saying it was to avoid plagiarism in levels, but it was never really clear if this person actually had any insight into the decision making or if they were just defending it. The general consensus among the community was that they did it to stop the spread of glitches, since Nintendo has been firmly against glitch levels in all capacities in both games. I mentioned how the community has developed browser-based tools for Mario Maker 2, but in Mario Maker 1, Nintendo had one of their very own. It was called the Bookmark site, and it was amazing. You could track leaderboards, first clears, and world records all on your browser. In Mario Maker 2, you can do this in-game, but only for the 100 most recent levels. So if a person has 1,000 first clears, you'll only be able to see the most recent 10%. The website also tracks plays, clears, and stars on every single level. I understand that you can access most of this on the Switch, but it was just so much faster to do it online, and we haven't talked about one of the best features. It would sync to your Nintendo ID on the console through the Bookmarks tab. This meant you didn't have to type in a code, you could just click Bookmark on the website and then load it up in-game. I really miss this feature. It was so convenient to have the levels I wanted to play in one place rather than my current method of a messy notepad full of level codes. The website also allowed third-party free services like Warp World to connect a bot to your Bookmarks tab, which made streaming viewer levels extremely convenient. Shout out to Jakku for making this back in the day. We also have to talk about one of the most important aspects of Mario Maker: the level editor. The user interface made so much sense with the gamepad's touchscreen. You can still use the Switch in handheld for the touchscreen, but the interface is clearly designed to be used in docked mode as well. This isn't a complaint I have with Mario Maker 2, I think that what we got is the best possible option given the way that the Switch works versus the Wii U. But that doesn't change the fact that the Wii U gamepad was the perfect controller for Mario Maker, and creating levels was incredibly intuitive. Then there's the case of 100 Man, one of the game's most popular modes. We have Endless in Mario Maker 2, which serves essentially the same function, but it's much less fun to me, and here's why. The biggest factor is the number of lives. 100 lives was enough for skilled players to beat really hard levels. So when you got a hard level in 100 Man, it didn't mean the run was over. 30 lives just restricts the kinds of levels that you can play by so much. And some of the most fun I had in 100 Man was beating a hard level and fighting to keep the run alive. In Endless, you're never trying to win, you're just trying not to lose. And that eventually always makes your run a failure. Yes, you can get a high score, skips or not, but the run always ends on a sour note. In Maker 1, you could actually save the princess, and getting to that screen after clutching out the last level on very few lives is an amazing experience that just can't be replicated in Mario Maker 2. You also would earn a reward for completing a 100-man run, which is something I know a lot of people miss: amiibo costumes. This honestly wasn't that big of a change for me, since every amiibo acted the same and just looked different, but there were some really creative levels that used amiibos, and it allowed for themed levels in a way that Mario Maker 2 just doesn't quite allow for. Amiibos aren't revolutionary or anything, but they added a lot of character to the game. But this change is really only scratching the surface. Let's get into actual gameplay changes now. In Mario Maker 2, there is a starting box that nothing can be built in, even aesthetic blocks like mushroom stems or semi-solids. In Maker 1, you could put anything here, including covering where Mario spawns, which would force the player to start falling in midair. This starting box is obviously there, so multiplayer is fair for everyone. But it would be much better if we could opt into our levels being playable in multiplayer. Instead, all levels are impacted by versus mode, even the levels that would never ever be played in multiplayer. Another one of the biggest changes is no spinning with items in SMW. Spin jumping Kaizo was extremely dynamic, and spinning-centric items such as bombs became a lot more fun. You'd be able to cancel your spin by throwing an item, and it just added an extra layer to SMW Kaizo. Spin jumping was also drastically improved by being able to spin jump off enemies as they sank in the lava. Interestingly, in Mario Maker 2, Mecha Koopas still have this trait, and the other thing that they do is bounce off walls. Every other item sticks to the walls in that game, but for some reason Mecha Koopas act like every Maker 1 enemy, both having a hitbox in lava and bouncing off walls. Items bouncing off walls may seem minor, but there were so many incredible levels that used this mechanics to its fullest potential. Goomba specifically would just go nuts, and anytime you spat an item with Yoshi, it was going to get ridiculous speed. On the subject of ridiculous speed, there's one genre of Kaizo levels that's absent from Mario Maker 2. I'm talking about express levels. Items sitting on shellmets no longer get the speed from that shellmet, so these setups are impossible. A small change to be sure, but definitely one that people miss. I also want to take a minute to talk about the new Soup game style. This theme is perhaps the biggest downgrade as it transitioned to Mario Maker 2. There's some fun tech missing, like Fire Flower wall climbs, or ground pounds giving you a little bit of extra height, or the fact that item wall carries were so much more fun when items didn't stick to walls, but the main problem with New Soup goes so much deeper than that. Wall jumps just feel slow. The community doesn't really know why it feels this way, but ask any advanced New Soup player about the differences, and they're bound to mention just how great New Soup used to feel. People continue to make really interesting New Soup speedruns in Maker 2, but there's no denying that it just feels less responsive when it comes to wall jumps and twirls. The other thing that just feels off in Mario Maker 2 is throw delay. When you throw an item in any style, the item will leave your hand much later than you actually release the X or Y button. By my own imperfect estimates, about 6 frames later. This is something you can get used to, no doubt, but going back to Mario Maker 1 and not having that delay when throwing items feels great. It's just one more way that Mario Maker 1 feels more responsive. The suspected reason they added this throw delay was to remove mid-air shell jumps, which were a precise trick that required you to turn left, then right, then release exactly 1 frame later after pressing right. The trick is pretty tough, but super satisfying to pull off, and I do wish we could still do them in Mario Maker 2. We can still do mid-air spring jumps in Maker 2, but they are super different. In Maker 1, spring jumps were generally the first Kaizo trick that people learned. As long as you let go of jump and run at the same time, they were pretty much automatic. By comparison, spring jumps in SMM2 are much slower and much more precise. It's a change that I'm not a fan of, although I can't necessarily call it a bad one. I just definitely think that spring jumps in Maker 1 were a lot easier to build around and a lot more fun to pull off. The other thing that was easier to build around was spikes and munchers. Oh my god, are their hitboxes terrible in Mario Maker 2. They fill up an entire block, so you always get these moments where it doesn't look like you're touching the muncher, but you die anyways. Very unsatisfying as a player. The other thing that was awesome was having the muncher and spike hitbox be different from each other. Munchers were smaller than spikes, so if you needed slight variation in hitboxes, that option was available to you. No such option exists in Maker 2, and the game definitely suffers for it. There were also a lot of changes to how Pows act. One very important difference is that shells hitting Pows in midair would not die to the Pow. This was super important since we didn't have on-off blocks, so makers would often use Pows to trigger upcoming events in Kaizo levels. Unfortunately, this doesn't work in Maker 2, but we do have a lot of the tools to build around it. The other change is how Pows don't pause after hitting a wall. In Maker 1, after dropping a Pow, it would hit the wall and stop for a moment, allowing the player to land on it. Maker 2 started this way as well, and if you play an old level, you can actually experience these Pows, but for some reason, early on in the game's life, this was changed. Very, very odd. Time for some rapid-fire tech that was in the first game, but not the second. Ready? Here we go. You could clip into walls and do a frame-perfect jump, both with high momentum and low momentum. Thwomps used to be considered ground when you landed on them with a star, which meant you could do a 1-frame jump, but it also meant that you could refresh your propeller or Yoshi flutter. You used to be able to jump off a spike on the first frame coming through a door. You could re-grab a shell with Cape or Tanuki. You could do a mid-air input with a Pow or a P-switch and get insane speed. The flagpole had a magnet on top of it and it would suck you down. Whatever this shit is. And holding an item in SMW, hooking up a Wiimote, and shaking it would allow you to get an impossibly small jump. No one actually misses this tech, I just think it's hilarious. There's my list for why Mario Maker 1 is better than Maker 2. This isn't to say that Mario Maker 2 doesn't have any good changes, there are actually quite a lot. And if people are interested, I'll make a video detailing what Mario Maker 2 got right. But in the meantime, did I miss any changes? Let me know what you missed from Maker 1 in the comments below.